This is an over 20-minute interview with Dr. John Blitch featuring Jim Garrison on Humanity Rising. If you're not familiar, Dr. John Blitch just came out on Newsnation in the Jake Barber whistleblower story that featured the egg-shaped craft. I'm sure you've seen that video. So anyway, please enjoy this interview. Let me know what you think.
First of all, thank you. This has been really impressive, and I'm very grateful for the kind of the logical precision with which you've delivered this material. And I want
to well, thank you, sir.
I want to start with this irony and this kind of tragic paradox of the military repressing its own personnel in such a systemic way. And as a military man yourself, who was, been really immersed in the military for many, many years, trained at West Point and so forth and so on, how do you understand I know that they did it. The question would be, why do you believe that they did it and sustain this in such a ferocious way for so long?
Yeah, I think it's similar to the dark side of Santa Claus. It is an effort to allow people to sleep at night. As I said, lights buzzing around in the sky, not a big worry. Even other critters, walking around on the planet, not scary enough. But if you showed me body parts that were aboard a flying saucer, or if you showed me a mutilated human body that looked like some of the cattle mutilations and horse mutilations that Linda Moulton Howe reported on early in her career, along with many others, you could have convinced me to suppress that secret and to try to bring the other kids on the block into the Santa Claus conspiracy. That would have worked for me back in 1979. Now, I want to be clear. I have never been read in on any UAP, UFO, special access program of any sort. And I forgot to mention that on my opening slide, that little disclaimer thing. I don't have to do that because I was never read in on any of that stuff. I ran some of my own special access programs, but it was related to robotics, not with anything to do with this effort. But that's what it would have taken to convince me to join the cabal, is to be that scared of my kids being taken out of their bedrooms at night. And I think that's the underpinning for the entire level of secrecy. That's how you can get good people to do harmful things to their friends and buddies to keep them quiet. It's the rationalization. I'm not saying it's right. And now I think the reason why Lou Elizondo is still alive and the reason why Dave Grush is still alive is because the reverse engineering that has occurred over the past half a century or so, I think it is successful enough now that we being the military-industrial complex, can protect a fairly significant portion of the populace from these abduction activities. Unfortunately, kind of like I mentioned with the killer bees, there's some collateral damage. We may be shooting down some of the good guys as well as some of the bad guys. And that's where we have to be very, very careful that we don't end up going the killer bee route rather than being honeybees in the galaxy. I know that was a long answer to a short question, Jim. I apologize.
Okay. Well, thank you. Take your time on these questions. They're big questions, and they require thoughtful responses. Now, let me ask you a follow-up questions about the abduction phenomenon as you understand it. How extensive do you believe this is? Is it a number in the hundreds? Is it the thousands? Is it largely limited to the United States, or say, and Russia and China, the nuclear possessing countries primarily? Is it a global phenomenon? What's your understanding of the scope of the abductions?
Well, so my library back there behind me is largely from my dad, um, as well as some of my own personal research. You know, while other soldiers were reading Playboy magazine and so forth, I was reading UFO books when I was on staff duty officer or whatever. And what I can say from the literature, the abundance of literature as I guess a research scholar in this realm, is number one, it is certainly not limited to just the U.S. It is certainly a global phenomenon. Two, very strong correlation between nuclear weapons testing and the abduction geography, if you will, or demographics, if you will. And it's not just right at the site of where the test was, it's where the fallout ends up, right? And so as you get this plume that gradually expands and gets up to what, flight level 30 or so, 30, 40,000 feet, and then it drifts with whatever the predominant winds are, and then wherever it cools and it comes back down, that's where you need to start sampling the polar bears. And so with Cold War testing in the upper latitudes of Eurasia, you know, it makes sense that you would look at, you know, the northeastern United States where Benny and Barney Hill were taken, where that cooling has occurred after it comes. So there's a lot of that aspect to it. That's the second point. And then the third point is based on Steve Aspen's books and John Mack and Bud Hopkins. So many people, not to mention Kathy Martin, Denny Stoner, so many people who have published really impressive work on this subject, just because it's not in a peer-reviewed journal article. How do you, it's part of the invisible college. So it may not be acceptable to, you know, the arrogant academic world who restrict their perspective to peer-reviewed journal articles, although we're getting better with that, with the Soul Foundation, a lot of these UAP-oriented efforts. Hopefully we'll get into that realm, but that's all you have right now. So when you look at all these folks, Richard Dolan, a lot of these folks who have this tremendous buildup of literature, you do find what appears to be another strong correlation in epigenetics, that it tends to run in families. And so those are the three trends that I'm aware about, and they make sense, especially if you're talking about the influence of, I'll call it nuclear pollution, on the global society and life that spans across, not just directly on the animals, but the notion of bioconcentration, where the food that the deer are eating in the vicinity of Chernobyl, and then the bigger fish eat the bigger fish, eat the bigger fish, you bioconcentrate, and you, in order to get an appreciation for what level of concentration that occurs, you know, you got to kind of sample throughout that family as it goes. So you're also getting an indicator of the pollution being ingested by plant life, and all throughout, you know, the water column or the entire ecosystem.
What would you say about the assertion of Steven Greer, for example, that many, if not most, of the abductions are actually conducted by humans and not sort of legitimate UFOs, extraterrestrials? And he believes that many of the, if not most of the UAP, UFO sightings and so forth and so on are actually advanced human technology, and that's also responsible for most of the abductions. What's your view of Steven Greer's perspective?
Well, I have an enormous amount of respect for Steven. I've been to the field with him on more than one occasion. I agree with the vast majority of his effort. But as I mentioned in my critical thinking about critical thinking, we got to be very careful about saying all about anything. So my claim is that, secondly, that's my first point. The second point is that I asked Bob Dean about this point blank back in 2008. When I first met him, I was very troubled about some of these reports. And I asked him point blank, Sergeant Major, are any of our brothers and sisters in uniform involved in this? And he looked at, I'm getting goosebumps as I recount this story. And it was kind of an ambush in a hallway at a conference. And he looked at me straight in the eyes, he always did, just a wonderful, very powerful soul. But he was embarrassed. And he looked down at the floor and he's holding his cane and he looked at his cane for a little bit. And then he looked back up at me and he said, yes, we have been involved, but you got to understand we had no choice because they were going to do it anyway. So it's kind of like you have our folks in uniform with the blue UN helmets that are observers, and all you could do is observe. So that was Sergeant Major Dean's perspective, but it was few and far between. It was a sprinkling, and it certainly wasn't our guys, ripping people open and then sewing them up with advanced technology, kind of like you see on Star Trek, and you got this long scar or these long needles like Betty Hill talked about, and there's a lot of terrifying procedures that I've already mentioned. So I do not think that we are specifically doing it. I think we have folks in uniform that are there as observers. In fact, Terry Lovelace in his book talks about how when he was there, I don't know if anyone was there with Dr. Bug laying on the table with the rest of the little gray guys around it, but he does talk about seeing a human being in a beige or a tan flight suit with some sort of orange patch on, and the guy was ignoring him. And so and he was not involved in any of the procedures. So I would defer to Terry for more on that, but that's my take on it. And I do not think that the USS Enterprise should launch out into the galaxy without phasers or photon torpedoes, because even if there's only 1%, you don't want to have zero weapons when you come up against. It's kind of like what I was talking about with the mom who has the universal right to protect her cubs. So she's not going to grind down her claws. I mean, every species has the right to protect themselves, whether or not it's an orca's teeth or ramming into the back of a sailboat because their sonars are messing with their young, or whatever it happens to be. So that's another issue I have with the Benevolent Space Brothers approach, is I think I am like 99% with them. I'm all on board, but don't ask me to leave my pistol behind, when we go out into grizzly territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, good point. And then just finally, before we close here, John, I'd like to have you discuss this whole issue of amnesty, because I know, being in Washington as I am and tracking the legislation for further disclosure, that's an issue that consistently comes up. What do you do in the
Yeah,
disclosure process with the people, as you've indicated, that have actively repressed the release of this information? And as David Grush said in his congressional testimony last July 26th, even engaged in murder
absolutely.
to keep people from speaking out. And so do we embrace the South African model of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Do we have sort of time limits? Anything over 25 years ago we don't bother with? Where do you come out on the issue of amnesty for the people who engaged in unconstitutional, illegal acts to repress the truth?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very insightful of you, and thank you, Jim. As I mentioned to you when we first talked, I guess about a month ago or so, I did visit Kirsten Gillibrand's office, and I dropped off a copy of Terry Lovelace's second book to try to get her to take some sort of action to get the Department of State involved. I think the military has had this long enough. We had control of this for 80 years, probably, possibly longer than that. And, we've kind of fumbled it. Everything was okay up until 9/11, and now we're just coming off of, another 20 years of war. How long are we going to keep cranking this, sort of war machine along? So I think it's time for the Department of State to get very heavily involved along the lines of honeybees instead of killer bees. I don't know if they should have the lead on that. That is up to politicians and folks with a legal background like Danny and yourself, and Terry would be a great representative to get involved with that as an abductee himself, and having a long, very distinguished career as a lawyer and assistant DA and attorney general. So I would love to get Terry in front of Congress, much like David Grush had his chance. We need to hear from Terry Lovelace. We need to hear from Mario Woods, and we need to hear from a large number of other very credible PRP qualified abductees to weigh in on this so we can crack this thing further. I think the abduction phenomenon is like the last crack. It's the last straw, because then it's wide open. And it does give the legacy folks a leg to stand on. It is rational to have them run black programs to reverse engineer advanced technology if we're trying to get a very small portion. It's not zero. I don't agree with Steven on that. It's not zero, but a small portion of the Galactic Society that are criminals. And I think this notion, I'm not sure if there is a Galactic Federation. I kind of hope there would be to kind of weigh in this 1% that's doing horrific things, not for science, but for some other reason. Maybe they're eating us. I don't know. I would like to think that there's some entity like that. But that's where the diplomats of the world, the legal professionals of the world need to get involved. And that's, I think, the next step. And that's what I've been pushing for, as I mentioned to you several weeks ago, is to get these folks in front of Congress, just like Dave.
Yeah, Yeah. Good. Well, thank you so much, John. I'm talking to Terry actually later today. We finally
Wonderful.
connected, so I'm hopeful of having him on Humanity Rising in just a little bit. But thank you so much for this extraordinary presentation. Now we didn't get a chance. Are you able to stay a few minutes longer
Sure,
in our after chat?
sure.
Oh, good, because I know a number of people have been wanting to know if you were going to do it. So it's another link. You'll see the link in the chat box that Stan will put up in a minute, and you received it in your Zoom invite. And that's where we switch to Zoom meeting, where everybody can see one another. So it doesn't need to take much of your time, but I think people would welcome an informal interaction. Yes, go ahead.
I would love to do that. I wanted to make one final point, though.
Sure.
I was really disappointed when Dave Grush first came out by the number of folks in the UFO witness community that there was a backlash against him. And my caution to society at large is, if every time a military whistleblower comes out, you trash him, how can you expect anybody else to come forward? We've got to treat each other compassionately,
Yes.
especially when you're talking to abductees. These folks have been through hell. And if you disagree with them, fine, take it offline. But we need to be, as the golden rule, we need to treat others as we would hope to be treated. And that's just my final point of reference for the true heroes out there like Dave and Lou and all of the other whistleblowers that will continue to come forward. The Bob Jacobs of the world, Mario, Lou, I could go on and on.
Yeah. Very good point. Amnesty starts and forgiveness starts with those who are courageous enough to speak the truth, for sure.
Right.
For sure. So thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
That brings us to a close for today. You'll see the link for the after chat if you want to join with John in a more informal conversation for a few minutes. And then you receive the after chat link in your Zoom reminder for today. And then we'll have our session tomorrow with Michelle Dupree on clairvoyance and the matter of extraterrestrial communication. So that'll be tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. Bye.
I live inside my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming in their cradles, profanities. I see the world through ice covered in ink and bleach. Cross out the ones who heard my cries and watched me weep.